As we begin tonight, I want you to think of a question. What is one of the most honorable things that you can think of a Christian doing? In your own personal life, what is one of the most honorable things you can think of a Christian doing? There's probably a whole list of things that are coming to mind for a lot of people that would be mentioned, but on that list would probably be something like Bible study, I imagine, for some people. And who do we think of when we think of diligent Bible study? We think of the Bereans. When you see this word Berean, what comes to mind? And this is important. I want you to picture, what is a Berean? What does that entail? What is involved with that? References to being a Berean are all over the place. You see it almost like a bumper sticker, where it's good for a Christian to do this, like Acts 17:11 says. It's seen as one of the most commendable things that a believing person can attain to, is being called a Berean. But do we understand this correctly, is what we're going to explore tonight. Are we correct in what we emphasize about the Bereans? Sometimes we can impose our own ideas onto things based on what we value. We all do that. As I believe we talked about in class this morning, we filter things through our own experiences, our own ideas. Our culture, and church culture in particular, really emphasizes diligent study, whether that's for a student or a Christian or whoever it is. And when you think about that, that's really the picture of the person alone with their books. A student poring over the textbooks and taking notes, or you might think of a preacher with all of his Bibles and commentaries, or whatever it is. And that's usually what comes to mind when we think about this. But I want to use tonight to look at this account of the Bereans that's probably familiar to most of you and see what we can learn from this. So we find after the riot in Thessalonica as a result of their preaching, as Eric read for us, we'll read it again. As soon as it was night, the brothers and sisters sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. Upon arrival, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. The people here were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, since they received the word with eagerness and examined the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. Consequently, many of them believed, including a number of the prominent Greek women as well as men. So what is it about these people that is so honorable? We're going to take 4 applications really from them tonight. We see first that what is said of them when Paul and Silas arrive is that these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. And really that word indicates usually somebody of a noble birth, of like a higher stock than other people. So from a good bloodline or something like that, but it is being used here really of their character and their personality. So these were a better kind of people than were in Thessalonica. In Thessalonica, in the earlier part of chapter 17, if you look over it, some of the people listened to Paul and Silas, believing that Jesus was the Messiah who would die and rise from the dead, and others were jealous, which is the word used in verse 5, because Paul and Silas were getting people to follow after them. So why were these people better than the Thessalonians? Well, really, I think it's summed up in a couple things, but we see that they were open-minded and excited to learn. They received the message with eagerness, it says, and we can see from the talk of these people's noble character and the excitement that they received what Paul had to say, that they were open-minded people. They could see that what Paul was talking about was important and were willing to see if what he said had value. So they would listen to him. We don't see that in the earlier example of Thessalonica. They were excited because it was an opportunity to understand truth. They understood Paul was making an argument from the scriptures about God, and they were willing to listen. This was a community of religious people And Paul and Silas came in and tried to convince them to think differently than they had been thinking. And usually that is sort of a contentious thing to do. But apparently it didn't matter if they were being proved wrong about something, or if they were being led down a different path. They were going to openly look at it, and they were going to examine it critically. So what kind of attitude do we take when others are trying to teach us then? We think of the Bereans, that they were open-minded and excited to learn. But what kind of attitude do we have when we're going to be taught? In my lifetime, this is my personal experience, I think I have seen a lot of what I'll call intellectual pride in the church that manifests as an attitude that says something like, I know more and I know best. So whether that's people in the church, I'm not going to listen, and especially those outside, I'm not going to listen. When we expose that, that's really very clearly not a commendable attitude to have, is it? But that's what it is. The question is, am I open-minded and humble when I have the opportunity to learn? The Bereans were, and that's the first thing that they're commended for, that they were open-minded, they were excited to learn, they were humble enough to listen to what Paul had to say. But in our experience, is that always how God's people operate? Not in mine. We don't always want to listen. We don't always want to stuff our pride enough to listen to somebody else. Note the contrast between the Thessalonican synagogue earlier in the chapter and this one here in Berea. When Paul taught and the people began to listen to him, the Thessalonians got jealous of him and started causing trouble. The Bereans openly listened. And when you put those two together and look at them side by side, the Bereans, they weren't upset that someone else had the spotlight. They were not upset that someone else was teaching something. And when you dig into a lot of the response of the Jews in the book of Acts, a lot of it just comes down to jealousy, that other people were gaining a following and they weren't. Their influence and their way of life was being disturbed. In Thessalonica, it seems people might have been mad that they weren't the guy. Paul was instead. But we don't get that with the Bereans. As a man named John Stott wrote, the adjective Berean has been applied to people who study the scriptures with impartiality and care. I think that's an important word, impartiality, that they were open and willing and humble to examine things honestly and objectively. And we should note that this was a deep desire to know the truths of God, not a casual thing. This was not something they did flippantly. It wasn't like later in the chapter where people say, this guy's saying something interesting, I guess we can listen to it a little bit more. They were devoted to what they were doing. They were open and excited. And I want to share another thing. This is actually from the same author. And what he says is, what is impressive is that neither the speaker nor hearers use Scripture in a superficial, unintelligent, or proof-texting way. On the contrary, Paul argued out of the Scriptures, and the Bereans examined them to see if his arguments were cogent. They didn't just go back and argue about things and say, as is said here, proof texting. This was a discussion. This was diligent. This was intentional. And you see that the way that they treat the Scriptures here is with the utmost respect. So a question that we need to ask ourselves, in looking in particular at this, is, do I approach study superficially? Is it something that I do for surface level reasons, whether it's to look good or to just figure out an answer to a question for information? Or do I approach it in just trying to proof text my beliefs? Do I just try to prove what the status quo is without actually engaging honestly with what God has to say? looking at the statement as we go back to looking at this, looking at the statement about what they did, the next thing that's said about them is that they examine the scriptures daily. Provides an opportunity to examine their situation, which I think should make us appreciate our situation more. And this is not necessarily directly derived from the text, but this is an observation that I want to make based on their context as opposed to ours. And the first thing that we should realize is they didn't have Bibles. They used the scriptures. It would have been the Old Testament. And this was a Jewish synagogue in the early first century. So what that typically meant is there was probably one collection of scrolls for the entire synagogue. And that starts to look a little bit different than what we typically think about it. I want us to learn that we should be grateful for the tools that we have. Again, this would have been one collection of scrolls for the whole group, and sometimes it looks like just the rabbis were able to look at them. And you would hear your teachers talking, and the rest would have to listen. But we can take for granted what we have if we don't understand our privilege in what we have. These people had to sit together with one massive scroll and try to search through everything and talk about it. That was a lot of effort. And we're all sitting here. I have a paper Bible. I've got a Bible here on my tablet. We have them on our phones. I mean, they're all over the place. And not to mention, we have 2,000 years of discussion and knowledge to draw from that, again, we can pull up on our phones or buy a book or whatever it is. They didn't have that, and we do. So let's be grateful for what God has provided for us. And that's not even to jump into the whole story of how we got this in our hands in the first place. I mean, that is a whole nother discussion. But let's be grateful for the tools that we have. Now, I want to look next, and this is probably one of the most important points that we're going to draw tonight. If you look at what they did throughout the verse here, in verse, I forgot to write it down, verse 11, they received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. And I want you to notice something. All of that was together. It's collective. This took place within the setting of a synagogue. As we just said, they didn't have private copies unless they were extremely wealthy. Some people did. They relied on each other and their teachers for understanding. And really what we should see is that they searched together. This wasn't an act in isolation. They were doing this in community. Often in synagogues there would be a reading, and then someone would give a sermon, which everyone would then discuss with the guidance of the skilled readers and teachers. And so you have the inner circle discussing a lot of times, and the rest of the people listening for their benefit. We see something like that in Acts chapter 13, where Paul is in the synagogue, and it says, after the reading from the law and the prophets, the leaders of the synagogue sent word to them saying, brothers, if you have a word of exhortation for the people, please speak. And if you look in between the lines, this shows you a little bit of the setting for what these people would experience. They would read the scriptures, someone would give a sermon, you might say, and then they would discuss it together. And so that's often what's happening when the apostles are coming into the synagogues. They are giving a sermon that would be sometimes in the synagogue service, or maybe it was something special that we're not noted of. And then everyone would discuss it together. Sometimes that was good, and sometimes that was bad, as we see. But this verse can help us to see the situation, that they were guided by their leaders. They read the scriptures. Someone gave a sermon, and it would be discussed in community. They searched together. I think this picture is very different from the conception of individualism that we usually have, especially with respect to study. And we get that from our Western culture. We get that from our American values. I mean, it is entrenched, this individualism, which we do not see in the New Testament. And that's something that we need to be aware of. Think about at the beginning of the lesson when I asked you to picture a Berean. What did it look like? What did that look like? Do we think of this as a community event? Or did you picture somebody with their pile of books? Because that is us imprinting our cultural values onto the text and not seeing what's actually going on. That they are doing this together in community. And because we have such easy access and abundance of tools for our benefit, sometimes it's easy to shift into this solitary mindset where it's just me and my Bible. And nowhere in the Bible are you going to find just me and my Bible, by the way. All of these letters that we have in the New Testament are written either directly to or tangentially to churches, collections of the Lord's people. It's not just something that you just do in your chair at home. And it was never intended to be. I think this is just a dangerous cultural attitude that we can sometimes fall into. And you can blame the Enlightenment, you can blame Western culture, it could be our particular circle of churches, whatever it is, but the fact is it exists. But it is supposed to be a community activity. We shouldn't consider Scripture as primary something solitary. This does not really belong to one person. This belongs to the people of God, to His body. We need each other. I need you. And just as an aside, when you see people get completely isolated with the Bible, usually what comes out of that room is a lot of kooky ideas. If you think about it, Waco, Texas, as an example, when you just get one guy and his Bible, a lot of weird things happen. And that should be enough to scare us. God placed us in community, in the body of Christ, for a reason. If we were placed together in the body, then apparently we need each other. And part of that is so that we can help each other learn, so that we can help each other understand more of God and His scheme for redemption and what it means in our lives. And obviously, this is not to say that private study is bad. I mean, what I've done standing up here right now and earlier today is the result of private study, hopefully. But the Scriptures are not just about me and my understanding. It's about us and our understanding. The question is, where is our emphasis? There is a balance. Is our emphasis on the together portion or the alone portion? Again, is it the attitude that we sometimes just imbibe of just me and my Bible, or is it me with the people of God and His living, breathing Word? And I want to note another thing about their searching together, and this is almost a sub-point to this point that we have just made, is that this was a way of life for these people. This appears to be a habit for them, not a one-time thing. They came together every day to devote time together to understand this that Paul had brought up. And I want to suggest, as just my conjecture, that if they hadn't been familiar with how to do that or what to do in this kind of situation, then it wouldn't have gone as smoothly as it did. Remember, Paul and Silas were at other synagogues, like Thessalonica, with a much different outcome. You don't see the same type of community attitude that the Bereans had, but these people were different. They had a different attitude, and it seems different habits. I want to say that this type of meeting for them was a way of life. if we read in between the lines. They didn't just get together to help each other at church times, but they made this a communal activity of seeking out God's will together. They made that a habitual way of life. And I want to say that is probably one of the reasons they were so receptive to the truth. And it says many of them joined, as opposed to some of them from earlier in the chapter. If we think about this, the Bereans, they were commended in Acts for the type of people that they were and what they did. And we are right to try to exemplify them. They are given as an example. They are called noble people for what they did. But we have to be careful, because the picture that I have seen painted in my experience and what I have heard preached to me from pulpits doesn't accurately reflect what the Bereans were praised for. They were open-minded and willing to learn. They didn't let pride get in the way. They weren't superficial about what they were doing. They didn't take what they had for granted. And this exercise was something that they did together. And that, I think, is what we need to reinvigorate. What that looks like specifically, I do not know. And that is for those of you with more experience. But we can see that this is something that we are supposed to be thinking of in community. That they worked hard to understand together what the truth was. And that this appears to be something they made a habit of, and it set them apart from others. Other synagogues, other Jews, as the way Luke records this. These were open-minded people in community, diligently seeking out God's will and to understand His revelation together. And none of us can do that by ourselves. You might think, well, I do my own study and I think about it and I come away with a lot of good answers. But that is also not completely on your own. Who else are you reading? What tools are you relying on? These are all still community discussions, whether it's a commentary or a Bible dictionary or an atlas or a translation. This is still community discussion. It is not something that we can do all on our own. This, the Bereans, is a healthy example to hold up. But as I was going through this, at one point it just kind of clicked with me that I was not understanding the picture that Luke was painting here. And the picture he's painting here is these people together. If you are here and you know this church, but you aren't plugged into this church, then we want you with us. And we need you with us as part of this vision. We need you to be what we're supposed to be. And if you're new here, look at this vision that we've examined of a supportive community trying to understand God together. That's what we want to be. And we'd love for you to be a part of it. So in a second, Greg is going to lead us in a song. If we can answer any questions for you, if you'd like to become a follower of Jesus, if there's something else that you need, you just have to let us know. As is often done, there is a convenient time after lessons to come up while we sing the last song. But again, talk to whoever you're sitting next to, talk to me in the back, whatever we can do for you. Just let us know while we stand and sing.